On a single October day in AD 31, Rome watched the most powerful man in the empire fall without a battle. He had commanded the emperor's guard, controlled access to the throne, and reshaped the state in his own image. By nightfall, his body lay exposed to the mob. Lucius Aelius Sejanus did not begin as a usurper. He began as a soldier's son, born into the equestrian order, raised within the disciplined world of imperial service. His father, Lucius Seius Strabo, had risen through loyalty and competence, eventually commanding the Praetorian Guard under Augustus. It was a position close to power, but still subordinate. For Sejanus, it became the foundation of something far more dangerous. When Augustus died in AD 14 and Tiberius succeeded him, the empire stood balanced on inherited authority. The new princeps was cautious, suspicious, and deeply aware that his legitimacy rested on a fragile arrangement between Senate, army, and memory. He needed stability. He needed loyal instruments. In Sejanus, he found one. Tiberius elevated Sejanus to co-commander of the Praetorian Guard. Within a few years, Sejanus maneuvered to become sole prefect. His first major structural transformation was quiet but decisive. Instead of scattering the Praetorian cohorts across Rome and nearby towns, he consolidated them into a single fortified camp, the Castra Praetoria, on the outskirts of the city. This was not a theatrical act. It was administrative, efficient, logical. It also created, for the first time, a concentrated armed force within immediate reach of the capital. The Guard had always existed to protect the emperor. Now it could also intimidate the Senate, suppress unrest, and influence succession. Sejanus understood that military adaptation was not only about battlefield formations. It was about proximity. He ensured that Rome's most elite soldiers were loyal not merely to the office of princeps, but to the man who commanded them daily. Tiberius, increasingly disillusioned with public life, withdrew from active governance in Rome. His temperament had always been austere. Over time, it hardened into isolation. By AD 26, he left the capital entirely, retreating to the island of Capri. The emperor did not abdicate. He ruled by correspondence. But physical absence altered perception. In Rome, Sejanus became the visible axis of power. Access to Tiberius passed through him. Petitions, accusations, political ambitions, all filtered through the prefect. The Senate continued to meet, laws continued to pass, but an invisible pressure defined the atmosphere. The charge of maestas, treason against the dignity of the Roman state, expanded in application. Prosecutions multiplied. Some were driven by genuine suspicion, others by opportunism. Informers thrived. Careers ended not with defeat in debate, but with denunciation. It would be simplistic to attribute every trial to Sejanus personally. The culture of treason accusations predated him. Yet sources, especially Tacitus, depict his hand guiding the process, encouraging charges against rivals, shaping the climate of fear. Whether every detail is accurate or colored by hindsight, the pattern is clear. Men connected to the imperial family, particularly those aligned with the memory of Germanicus, fell under suspicion. Germanicus had been popular, charismatic, and seen by many as a natural heir. His death in AD 19 destabilized that alternative line of affection within the empire. His widow, Agrippina the Younger, and her sons became focal points for political sympathy. Over time, they too were accused, isolated, and removed. Exile, imprisonment, starvation. The Julio-Claudian house contracted inward. Sejanus' ambition sharpened during these years. He sought not only influence but legitimacy. He divorced his wife and pursued marriage with Livilla, widow of Drusus, Tiberius' son. Drusus had died in AD 23 under circumstances later alleged to involve poisoning. Ancient accounts accuse Sejanus and Livilla of orchestrating it. Modern historians treat the charge cautiously, recognizing that many accusations were written after Sejanus' fall, when vilification served political need. What remains certain is that Drusus' death removed a direct heir and intensified the question of succession. Tiberius refused Sejanus permission to marry Livilla. The refusal was significant. It signaled that, despite trust, there were limits. Sejanus remained an equestrian. He was granted extraordinary honors, statues, joint consulship in AD 31. His name was spoken alongside the emperor's. But bloodlines still mattered. Rome's memory of monarchy was bitter. Appearances required careful management. Meanwhile, Sejanus consolidated allies within the Senate and the administrative machinery. Clients owed him advancement. Officers owed him command. Even without the imperial title, he operated as the empire's central broker. The siege mechanics of politics did not require walls or battering rams. They required patience, isolation, and controlled access. Rivals were not attacked directly. They were encircled by accusations, deprived of support, left exposed to legal assault. Yet power built on proximity is vulnerable to distance. On Capri, Tiberius observed from afar. Letters traveled back and forth. Reports accumulated. At some point, whether through new evidence, shifting alliances, or simple mistrust, the emperor's confidence eroded. The precise trigger remains debated. Ancient sources suggest that Antonia Minor, mother of Livilla, warned Tiberius of Sejanus' designs. Others imply that Tiberius had always intended to test him. What is clear is that in AD 31, the emperor acted. Sejanus was serving as consul alongside Tiberius, an extraordinary symbolic elevation. He appeared secure. The Praetorian Guard was under his long command. The Senate deferred. Public honors multiplied. It was at this peak that Tiberius sent a letter to the Senate. The letter was read aloud. Its opening lines were ambiguous, even complimentary. Then its tone shifted. It accused Sejanus of conspiracy. It declared him an enemy of the state. The reading created confusion, then shock. The Senate, trained to read imperial signals, understood immediately which way survival lay. Sejanus was arrested in the Senate House. The Praetorian Guard did not intervene. Tiberius had ensured that command of the cohorts was temporarily placed in the hands of Naevius Sertorius Macro, a loyal replacement positioned in advance. The consolidation that had once empowered Sejanus now facilitated his capture. A centralized force could be redirected as swiftly as it had been built. By evening, Sejanus was condemned and executed. There was no protracted trial, no negotiated exile. His body was cast down the Gemonian stairs, exposed to public abuse before being thrown into the Tiber. His children were also killed, one after the other, in accordance with Roman precedent for traitors. Statues were toppled, names were erased. The Senate decreed damnatio memoriae. The fall was not gradual. It was engineered. A political siege completed in a single day. But the consequences did not end with his death. The machinery of suspicion he had helped cultivate did not dissolve. If anything, it intensified. The emperor, now convinced of betrayal at the highest level, withdrew further into distrust. Prosecutions continued. Networks associated with Sejanus were hunted down. Informers, sensing new opportunity, denounced former allies to prove loyalty. The Praetorian Guard remained in its fortified camp. The structural transformation endured. The concentration of armed power in Rome, once Sejanus' instrument, would outlive him by centuries. The execution of Sejanus did not restore calm to Rome. It detonated something far more enduring. Power had shifted in a single day, but fear remained embedded in the structure he had helped perfect. In the immediate aftermath of AD 31, the Senate moved with mechanical obedience. Decrees condemned Sejanus as a public enemy. His statues were shattered across the city and in provincial towns where his likeness had been displayed beside that of Tiberius. Inscriptions were chiseled away. Official records were amended. The ritual of erasure, damnatio memoriae, was meant to purify the state by obliterating the traitor's presence. Yet the speed and ferocity of the response revealed something else. Rome had lived under tension long before his fall. The Praetorian Guard did not fracture. That fact was decisive. Tiberius' calculated replacement of Sejanus with Naevius Sertorius Macro ensured continuity of force. The cohorts remained consolidated in the Castra Praetoria, disciplined and loyal to the reigning princeps. The very military adaptation that had elevated Sejanus now preserved imperial stability. There was no urban uprising, no contest between factions of armed men. The transition was surgical, but politically the purge widened. Associates of Sejanus, real, suspected, or merely connected, were summoned before the Senate. The charge of maestas expanded again. Letters were produced, testimonies extracted. Tacitus records a wave of trials in which men who had praised Sejanus months earlier now denounced him and anyone linked to him. In a system built on proximity to power, yesterday's ally became today's liability. Tiberius remained on Capri. His physical absence deepened the atmosphere of uncertainty. Orders arrived in writing. Condemnations were endorsed from afar. The emperor's letters, sometimes cautious, sometimes severe, guided the Senate's hand. There was no visible sovereign to read in person, no facial expression to interpret. Authority became textual. Interpretation became survival. The psychological warfare of the period was subtle but relentless. No formal decree announced a general terror, yet the pattern of accusation ensured that uncertainty governed elite life. Informers, delators, operated within the legal framework. They did not break Roman law. They used it. Treason was defined broadly enough to encompass words, gestures, associations. Wealth of the condemned often reverted to the state, creating material incentives for prosecution. The boundary between loyalty and danger blurred. Sejanus' children were executed in accordance with Roman precedent for traitors. His daughter, still a minor, was reportedly violated before execution because Roman custom forbade the execution of virgins. Ancient sources recount this detail with cold precision. Whether the full horror unfolded exactly as described cannot be independently verified, but the account reflects the severity with which the state sought to extinguish his line. Rome did not simply remove threats. It erased them. Livilla, whose alleged involvement in Drusus' death had tied her fate to Sejanus, disappeared from public life. Later traditions suggest she was executed or forced to starve by her mother Antonia Minor after her complicity became known. The evidence is fragmentary, colored by posthumous hostility towards Sejanus. What remains certain is that the Julio-Claudian household contracted further, marked by suspicion and internal fracture. The broader geopolitical structure of the empire did not collapse during this convulsion. Legions along the Rhine and Danube maintained discipline. Provincial administration continued. Taxation flowed. Roads were guarded. The empire's external machinery was robust enough to withstand internal purges at the center. This resilience was not accidental. Augustus had designed a system in which military commands were distributed among trusted legates, distant from Rome's political turbulence. Yet the concentration of the Praetorian Guard within the capital created a new reality. The Guard had proven that it could elevate a prefect to near sovereign authority. It had also demonstrated that its loyalty could be redirected by imperial command. Future emperors would never forget this dual lesson. Control of the Guard was not optional. It was existential. Tiberius' behavior after Sejanus' fall suggests a man hardened rather than relieved. Ancient historians, particularly Tacitus and Suetonius, portray his later years as increasingly reclusive and severe. Some accounts descend into lurid description of depravity on Capri, but modern scholarship treats many of these claims cautiously, recognizing the moralizing tone of senatorial historians hostile to his regime. What is less disputed is the persistence of trials and executions through the early 30s AD. The purge did not end with Sejanus. It expanded outward. Macro, the new prefect, navigated a delicate balance. He had been instrumental in Sejanus' arrest, but his authority depended entirely on Tiberius' favor. Unlike Sejanus, he did not attempt to construct an independent political base of comparable scale. His power was reactive, not transformative. The Guard remained centralized, yet its prefect did not overshadow the Senate in the same manner. The siege mechanics of politics shifted from a single dominant figure to a dispersed climate of vigilance. Senators monitored one another. Alliances became cautious. Public speech narrowed. The imperial center was no longer defined by one ambitious prefect, but by the emperor's remote scrutiny. One of the most significant long-term consequences concerned succession. With Germanicus dead and Drusus gone, the remaining viable heirs were the young Gaius, later known as Caligula, and Tiberius Gemellus, grandson of Tiberius. During the height of Sejanus' power, the line of Germanicus had been targeted and diminished. After the purge, Gaius was brought to Capri, where he lived under Tiberius' watchful eye. The survival of Gaius during these years would shape the empire's future in ways few could anticipate. The elimination of Sejanus removed a potential intermediary ruler. It also reaffirmed that ultimate authority resided solely with the princeps. The Senate's rapid reversal, from honoring Sejanus as co-consul to condemning him as traitor, exposed the fragility of elite loyalty. The body that once represented republican governance now functioned as an instrument responding to imperial signals. In strategic terms, the episode demonstrated the efficiency of centralized command combined with delayed execution. Tiberius did not confront Sejanus openly. He waited, gathered information, replaced key personnel, and struck through institutional channels. There was no civil war because there was no visible contest. The battle had occurred in correspondence, in appointments, in timing. The broader Roman world observed the lesson. Provincial elites learned that favor in Rome could evaporate instantly. Military commanders understood that proximity to armed force did not guarantee security without imperial trust. The Praetorian Guard, though silent during the crisis, had become a permanent political actor simply by existing in concentrated form. By the time Tiberius died in AD 37, the structures shaped during Sejanus' rise and fall were embedded in imperial governance. Centralized guard, expansive treason laws, a Senate conditioned to react swiftly, an emperor ruling from physical distance, yet exercising decisive control. Sejanus had attempted to convert delegated authority into dynastic power. His failure did not dismantle the system he exploited. It refined it. When Tiberius died in March AD 37, the empire did not erupt into chaos. It shifted carefully from one uncertainty to another. The memory of Sejanus lingered like a warning embedded in the architecture of power. Macro, still prefect of the Praetorian Guard, moved quickly. The death of an emperor was always a vulnerable moment, but the centralized guard ensured that Rome remained controlled. Gaius, son of Germanicus, had been at Capri in the final years of Tiberius' life. Whether Tiberius intended to leave power jointly to Gaius and his own grandson Gemellus, as some sources suggest, or whether that arrangement was quickly neutralized by political maneuvering, the result was decisive. Gaius emerged as sole princeps. The Senate ratified the transition. The Guard supported it. The machine continued. The structural transformation that Sejanus had engineered, consolidation of the Praetorian cohorts, proved its durability. The Guard was no longer merely a protective detail. It was the hinge upon which succession turned. Macro's loyalty to Gaius secured the initial transfer of authority. Yet this loyalty was transactional, not ideological. The lesson of Sejanus remained clear. A prefect who accumulated too much independent influence could threaten the emperor himself. Gaius' early reign began with gestures of reconciliation. He recalled exiles. He honored the memory of his father Germanicus. Public celebrations emphasized renewal rather than suspicion. For a brief period, Rome experienced relief from the intensity that had characterized Tiberius' later years. The treason trial slowed. The atmosphere seemed lighter, but the institutional framework did not revert to an earlier republican equilibrium. The Senate remained conditioned by decades of imperial dominance. The Guard remained centralized and politically decisive. The legal instruments that had facilitated purges were still available. Structural change in Rome was rarely reversed. It was repurposed. Macro's position became precarious as Gaius consolidated his own authority. Ancient sources suggest that Macro eventually fell from favor and was forced to commit suicide.
The precise details are debated, but his removal reinforced the pattern. Proximity to imperial power was inherently unstable. The prefect of the guard could elevate an emperor, but he could not overshadow him. Under Gaius, the Praetorian Guard's role expanded subtly. The emperor relied on it not only for security but as a visible symbol of his authority. Public appearances emphasized military presence. The Guard's loyalty was cultivated through donatives, financial rewards upon accession and at key moments. This practice, while not unprecedented, deepened the financial bond between emperor and soldiers stationed in Rome. It also reinforced the Guard's expectation of material recognition. The long-term geopolitical impact of Sejanus' consolidation thus extended beyond his lifetime. By bringing the Guard into a single fortified camp near the capital, he had transformed it into a standing political instrument. Future emperors could not ignore it. They had to command it, reward it, and monitor it simultaneously. Gaius' reign, however, deteriorated. Ancient historians portray increasing autocracy, erratic decisions, and financial strain. Modern scholarship treats some accusations with caution, recognizing the hostile tone of senatorial sources, yet it is evident that relations between emperor and senate deteriorated sharply. Executions resumed. Confiscations reappeared. The climate of fear did not reach the systemic scale of Tiberius' later years, but distrust intensified. In AD 41, the Guard demonstrated its ultimate capacity. Members of the Praetorian Guard participated directly in the assassination of Gaius. The killing did not arise from a spontaneous riot. It was a targeted act involving officers such as Cassius Chaerea, motivated by personal grievance and broader dissatisfaction. The concentration of armed men within Rome made such an act feasible. The emperor was vulnerable not on a distant battlefield, but within his own palace corridors. After the assassination, the Senate briefly contemplated restoration of the Republic. It was a familiar reflex, an invocation of ancestral liberty. Yet the Guard acted first. They discovered Claudius, uncle of Gaius, and proclaimed him emperor. The Senate, confronted with an armed fait accompli, ratified the decision. This moment crystallized the transformation that had begun under Sejanus. The Praetorian Guard did not merely protect the emperor, it could select him. The consolidation of the cohorts decades earlier had created a concentrated force capable of decisive intervention in succession crises. The Guard's loyalty was no longer abstract allegiance to the state. It was a practical alignment with whoever ensured its security and reward. Claudius, aware of the circumstances of his elevation, strengthened ties with the Guard through substantial donatives. Financial incentives became embedded in accession rituals. The political economy of empire adjusted accordingly. The treasury had to accommodate the expectations of soldiers stationed at the heart of power. Beyond Rome, the empire continued to expand. Claudius initiated the conquest of Britain in AD 43, a major military undertaking requiring coordination of legions, naval forces, and logistical supply lines. This external campaign demonstrated that internal turbulence did not paralyze imperial ambition. The Roman military machine, distributed across provinces, retained operational coherence. Yet the centrality of the Praetorian Guard in succession politics remained an internal constant. The psychological legacy of Sejanus' fall also endured. Emperors grew wary of powerful ministers. Administrative authority was often divided to prevent any single equestrian official from replicating his influence. Surveillance, both formal and informal, became normalized within elite circles. The memory of a prefect who had nearly positioned himself as dynastic partner lingered in imperial caution. Under Nero, who succeeded Claudius in AD 54, the Guard again played a pivotal role. The prefect Burrus, alongside Seneca, guided the early years of Nero's reign. Their influence was substantial but carefully framed as advisory rather than rival. After Burrus' death, the prefecture passed to Tigellinus, whose loyalty to Nero reinforced the emperor's increasingly autocratic behavior. The Guard's support became a critical pillar sustaining Nero amid senatorial hostility. When Nero's regime collapsed in AD 68, the year of the four emperors exposed the full strategic consequence of centralized military power. The Praetorian Guard abandoned Nero, later auctioned its support to Didius Julianus, and shifted allegiance as rival claimants marched on Rome. The empire descended into civil war, not because the external legions were weak, but because the mechanism of succession had become militarized at the center. Sejanus had not foreseen these specific outcomes. His ambition was personal, immediate. Yet his structural reform, the permanent consolidation of the Praetorian cohorts, altered the balance between civil authority and armed presence in the capital. What had begun as an administrative improvement evolved into a lever capable of moving emperors. The Roman state survived these convulsions because its provincial legions ultimately determined supremacy through battlefield victory. Vespasian's triumph restored order after AD 69, reasserting that broader military command outweighed the Guard's localized influence. Even so, Vespasian retained the centralized Guard. The structure was too entrenched, too useful, to dismantle entirely. Thus the shadow of Sejanus extended across generations. Not through memory alone. Through institutions that outlived him. By the late 1st century, the Roman Empire had absorbed civil war, assassination, and dynastic fracture without disintegrating. It had done so not by restoring the Republic but by refining autocracy. The mechanisms that enabled Sejanus' ascent and destruction were no longer anomalies, they were integrated into imperial governance. After the chaos of AD 69, Vespasian emerged as emperor through military victory. Unlike Sejanus, he did not depend on manipulation within Rome's political corridors. His authority rested on legions stationed in the provinces, particularly those in the east that had proclaimed him. Yet once in power, he did not dismantle the Praetorian Guard or disperse its camp. He understood that the concentration of force near the capital was both a threat and a necessity. Instead, he reshaped its leadership. The prefecture was entrusted to men of proven loyalty, and its internal discipline was tightened. The lesson was clear: control the Guard, do not confront it. Institutional memory had absorbed the danger of allowing a single prefect to accumulate independent political networks comparable to those Sejanus once built. Under the Flavian dynasty, administrative authority expanded. Financial reform, provincial reorganization, and construction projects stabilized the empire after civil conflict. Yet the shadow of treason law remained. The charge of maestas did not vanish, it evolved. Emperors deployed it selectively, aware that overt excess risked destabilizing elite cooperation. The psychological pressure that had characterized Tiberius' later years was moderated, but never entirely removed. Domitian, who ruled from AD 81 to 96, reintroduced a sharper climate of suspicion. Ancient sources, particularly senatorial historians, describe his reign as increasingly autocratic. Executions of prominent senators occurred. Informers reappeared as instruments of imperial policy. Whether Domitian's severity matched the hostility of his chroniclers is debated, but the dynamic is familiar: centralized authority paired with legal mechanisms capable of silencing opposition. The Praetorian Guard during Domitian's reign remained a decisive actor. Its loyalty secured his position for years despite elite resentment. When he was assassinated in AD 96, the plot emerged from within the palace and involved court officials rather than a direct military uprising. Yet once again, succession required the Guard's acquiescence. The Senate proclaimed Nerva emperor, but his authority was fragile until he adopted Trajan, a respected general commanding legions on the Rhine. The adoption signaled alignment with broader military power, reducing the risk of Guard rebellion. The pattern that began under Sejanus, centralized armed force influencing succession, continued to shape imperial strategy. Emperors increasingly balanced two axes of control: the Praetorian Guard in Rome and the frontier legions distributed across the empire's vast borders. Stability required equilibrium. Favor one excessively and the other might revolt. During the 2nd century, often termed the era of the 5 good emperors, relative internal stability prevailed. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius managed succession through adoption rather than biological inheritance, selecting heirs deemed capable. This practice reduced overt competition within the capital. The Guard remained influential but did not dominate politics as it would in later centuries. Yet even in this comparatively stable period, the institutional legacy of earlier transformations endured. The Castra Praetoria stood as a permanent reminder that Rome housed a concentrated military presence. Donatives continued to mark accessions. The expectation that soldiers would be rewarded for loyalty was embedded in political culture. Under Marcus Aurelius, external pressures intensified. Wars along the Danube against Germanic tribes strained resources and required prolonged imperial presence on campaign. The emperor's extended absence from Rome echoed Tiberius' earlier withdrawal, though under different circumstances. Administrative correspondence flowed between frontiers and capital. The empire functioned through delegated authority, careful reporting and disciplined command chains. When Commodus succeeded his father in AD 180, the equilibrium faltered. Ancient historians describe erratic behavior and increasing reliance on favorites within the court. The Praetorian Guard, accustomed to influence, became entangled in palace intrigues. In AD 192, Commodus was assassinated, and once more the Guard played a central role in the succession crisis that followed. The Year of the Five Emperors in AD 193 revealed how deeply militarized imperial politics had become. The Praetorian Guard, after murdering the Emperor Pertinax when he attempted to impose stricter discipline, effectively auctioned the throne to Didius Julianus. This unprecedented act shocked the Roman world. Authority was openly commodified within the capital's barracks. Yet the empire did not accept this outcome passively. Provincial legions proclaimed their own commanders: Septimius Severus, Pescennius Niger, Clodius Albinus. Civil war followed. Severus marched on Rome, disbanded the existing Praetorian Guard, and replaced it with troops loyal to him from the Danubian legions. This decisive restructuring acknowledged a reality that had been evolving since Sejanus' time. A centralized guard could shape politics, but it was not invincible against broader military power. Severus' actions marked both continuity and transformation. He retained the concept of a strong guard but altered its composition to ensure personal loyalty. He also increased soldiers' pay across the empire, deepening the financial bond between army and emperor. The political economy of imperial rule shifted further toward militarization. From Sejanus' consolidation of the Guard to Severus' reconstitution of it, the arc is visible. A structural innovation designed to enhance security had gradually amplified the military's political leverage. Emperors adapted, recalibrated, sometimes overcorrected. But none returned to a model in which the capital was demilitarized. The broader geopolitical impact extended beyond Rome's walls. As frontier pressures mounted in the 3rd century, with Persian resurgence in the east and intensified incursions along the Rhine and Danube, emperors increasingly rose from military backgrounds. Legitimacy derived less from senatorial endorsement and more from command over troops. The Senate's role, already diminished since the early Principate, receded further into ceremonial functions. The psychological atmosphere that had once surrounded Sejanus, suspicion, proximity to armed power, strategic elimination of rivals, became normalized features of imperial politics. Individual actors changed. The structural tension between centralized authority and military influence persisted. The Roman Empire did not collapse because of Sejanus, but it was permanently altered by the system he helped refine. By the 3rd century, the transformation was unmistakable. The empire no longer revolved around senatorial consensus or dynastic continuity. It revolved around armed legitimacy. The consolidation of military authority in and around the capital, first systematized under Sejanus, had matured into a political reality where emperors were made and unmade by soldiers. The crisis of the 3rd century did not erupt from a single conspiracy or a solitary prefect's ambition. It emerged from structural pressures, external invasion, economic strain, and internal fragmentation. But its volatility was intensified by a system in which centralized military power had long been intertwined with succession. After the Severan dynasty, rapid turnover became common. Emperors rose from provincial commands, proclaimed by their legions, and marched toward Rome seeking recognition. The Praetorian Guard, though reshaped and sometimes purged, remained a decisive force within the capital. Yet its dominance was no longer uncontested. Frontier armies carried equal, often superior, weight. The siege mechanics of imperial politics had evolved. No longer confined to intrigue within Senate halls or letters sent from an island retreat, they now unfolded across entire provinces. When Maximinus Thrax seized power in AD 235, proclaimed by troops on the Rhine, he bypassed traditional senatorial approval. His reign began not with institutional negotiation but with military endorsement. Rome became the destination of power rather than its source. The Senate attempted resistance at moments, backing rival claimants such as Gordian I and II in Africa, but without sustained military backing, such efforts faltered. The empire fragmented into competing spheres of authority. The Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene regime in the east operated semi-independently during the mid-3rd century. Yet even in fragmentation, the underlying logic remained consistent. Armed force defined sovereignty. The Praetorian Guard's role fluctuated. In some reigns it exerted heavy influence. In others it was overshadowed by frontier commanders. What endured was the principle that the capital housed a permanent military presence capable of intervention. The Castra Praetoria, erected under Sejanus' supervision, still stood. It symbolized the institutionalization of armed proximity to political authority. Emperors during this era relied increasingly on rapid mobility. Campaigns against Gothic incursions, Persian offensives under the Sasanian dynasty, and internal usurpers required constant movement. The emperor was no longer a distant administrator but a field commander. This shift altered the psychological dynamic between ruler and army. Loyalty was forged in campaign tents and battle formations rather than in ceremonial processions. Aurelian, who ruled from AD 270 to 275, demonstrated the capacity of a strong military leader to restore coherence. He defeated the Palmyrene queen Zenobia and reintegrated the Gallic territories. His construction of the Aurelian walls around Rome underscored the new reality. Even the capital required fortified defense. External threats had intensified to such a degree that the symbolic heart of the empire was no longer presumed invulnerable. Yet Aurelian himself was assassinated by officers amid internal suspicion. The pattern repeated. Centralized command bred both authority and vulnerability. The emperor depended on loyalty that could fracture under fear or ambition. The broader geopolitical consequences of this militarization were profound. Resources shifted increasingly toward sustaining the army. Taxation intensified. Coinage was debased to meet fiscal demands, contributing to economic instability. Administrative reforms sought efficiency, but the constant turnover of rulers hindered long-term planning. The psychological environment within elite circles hardened. Survival required flexibility, caution, and sometimes swift betrayal. The legal instruments of treason and denunciation remained available, though now often secondary to open military revolt. Where Sejanus had operated through calculated prosecution and senatorial manipulation, 3rd century usurpers relied more directly on armed proclamation. Diocletian's accession in AD 284 marked a decisive attempt to stabilize the empire through structural overhaul. Recognizing that a single ruler could no longer effectively manage vast frontiers and internal instability, he instituted the Tetrarchy. Authority was divided among 2 senior emperors and 2 junior colleagues. This was not a return to republicanism. It was an administrative solution to the problem of overconcentration and vulnerability. The Praetorian Guard's political influence diminished under Diocletian's reforms. The emperor reduced its centrality, relying more heavily on mobile field armies. Eventually, under Constantine in the early 4th century, the Guard was disbanded after supporting a rival claimant. The Castra Praetoria was dismantled. The structure that Sejanus had once used to amplify his power was physically erased. Yet the underlying lesson remained embedded in imperial governance. Centralized military force could both secure and destabilize authority. Diocletian and Constantine did not demilitarize the empire. They redistributed power across multiple commands and capitals. New imperial residences emerged in places like Nicomedia, Milan, and later Constantinople. The geographic center of authority shifted eastward, reducing Rome's singular political weight. The long arc from Sejanus to Constantine reveals continuity beneath change. Sejanus did not invent ambition, nor did he create the Praetorian Guard. But by consolidating it into a permanent, fortified presence adjacent to Rome, he accelerated the militarization of imperial politics. His fall demonstrated that even a prefect commanding elite troops could be eliminated by strategic imperial action. His rise demonstrated that proximity to armed force could elevate an equestrian to near-dynastic status. Over centuries, emperors learned to adapt to this dual reality. Some attempted balance through adoption and cooperation with the Senate. Others relied on fear and donatives. Still others restructured the administrative map of the empire entirely. None ignored the relationship between military concentration and political authority. By the time Constantine founded Constantinople in AD 330, the empire had effectively reoriented its center of gravity. Rome remained symbolically significant, but it was no longer the uncontested nexus of power. The dangers inherent in a single fortified military camp overshadowing the capital had been internalized. Sejanus' body had been thrown into the Tiber in AD 31. The system he helped sharpen endured for 3 centuries. When Constantine dissolved the Praetorian Guard in the early 4th century, he was not simply punishing a disloyal unit. He was closing a chapter that had begun in the reign of Tiberius. The Guard had backed his rival Maxentius. After defeating Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in AD 312, Constantine moved decisively. The Castra Praetoria was dismantled. The institutional body that had once elevated emperors and murdered them in turn was disbanded. Its political history had become a liability. Yet the dissolution did not reverse the militarization of imperial authority. It redistributed it. Constantine reorganized the army into distinct categories: mobile field forces and frontier troops. The emperor's personal security shifted to new elite units loyal directly to him, such as the Scoli Palatini. These formations fulfilled many of the protective functions once associated with the Praetorian Guard but lacked its entrenched political identity in Rome. The capital itself was no longer the singular center of gravity. By founding Constantinople in AD 330, Constantine reshaped the empire's geography of power. The new city, strategically positioned between Europe and Asia, closer to the Danube and eastern frontiers, reflected shifting priorities. Rome remained monumental, layered with memory and tradition, but imperial residence increasingly lay elsewhere. The structural vulnerability created by concentrating political authority and armed force in a single historic capital was diluted. The psychological transformation was equally significant. For centuries, the image of Rome as the heart of the empire had intertwined with the presence of the Guard. Senators, magistrates, and emperors had operated within a city where elite soldiers were permanently stationed nearby. Now, authority radiated outward. Multiple administrative centers reduced the likelihood that one concentrated military body could dominate succession. Yet the broader strategic logic that had emerged since Sejanus persisted. Control of elite troops remained essential. The difference was in scale and distribution. Instead of one fortified camp outside Rome shaping imperial politics, multiple imperial courts commanded their own protective forces. Power became more dispersed but not less martial. The 4th century introduced additional complexity. Christianity, legalized under Constantine and later favored by imperial policy, altered ideological frameworks. Emperors now presented themselves not only as military commanders and civic rulers but as divinely sanctioned guardians of a universal faith. This spiritual dimension did not diminish reliance on force. It reframed it. Conflicts continued. The empire faced renewed Persian pressure under the Sasanian dynasty. Germanic confederations pressed along the Rhine and Danube. Internal usurpations remained frequent. Constantine himself fought civil wars against Licinius before achieving sole rule. The mechanism differed from the senatorial intrigues of Sejanus' era, yet the core dynamic, armed competition for supreme authority, remained intact. Administrative reforms under Diocletian and Constantine had multiplied bureaucratic offices, separated civil and military commands and provinces, and sought to reduce the capacity of any single governor to replicate the concentrated influence once wielded by Sejanus. The equestrian prefecture of the Guard had once combined military command with intimate access to the emperor. Later systems fragmented authority deliberately. Praetorian prefects evolved into high-ranking civil administrators without direct military command. The title survived, the function transformed. This evolution underscores a deeper strategic lesson absorbed over centuries. Unchecked proximity to both armed force and imperial confidence could destabilize the state. By separating spheres of power, later emperors aimed to prevent another Sejanus from emerging. Institutional memory, though not always explicitly acknowledged, guided structural design. The geopolitical map of the empire continued to strain under pressure. In AD 378, the Battle of Adrianople saw the Eastern Emperor Valens killed by Gothic forces. The defeat exposed weaknesses in frontier management and the integration of barbarian groups within Roman territory. Yet even in crisis, the imperial framework adapted. Theodosius I stabilized the East and briefly reunified the empire before his death in AD 395. After Theodosius, the empire formally divided into eastern and western halves under his sons Arcadius and Honorius. The division was administrative rather than ideological, but it marked a turning point. The Western Empire, with its capital shifting from Rome to Milan and later Ravenna, faced mounting challenges. Germanic incursions intensified. Economic resources thinned. Political authority fragmented. In this altered landscape, the absence of a politically dominant Guard in Rome did not prevent instability. Instead, new power brokers emerged. Powerful generals of barbarian origin such as Stilicho and later Ricimer, who operated as kingmakers behind weak emperors. The dynamic echoed the earlier pattern. Though the Praetorian Guard no longer existed, concentrated military authority near the imperial court continued to influence succession and policy. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476, when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, was not the result of a single institutional flaw. It was the culmination of economic strain, demographic shifts, military overextension and internal fragmentation. Yet the long history of militarized politics, of emperors dependent on armed elites in close proximity, formed part of the background. In the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, imperial authority endured for nearly a millennium more. The capital at Constantinople housed its own elite units, such as the Excubitors and later the Varangian Guard. The pattern persisted. Emperors relied on specialized troops for security and legitimacy. Succession crises often unfolded within palace corridors backed by armed factions. Sejanus himself was long dead, his name officially erased in his own time. But the tension between centralized military protection and political ambition continued to define imperial governance. His rise had demonstrated how a trusted commander could transform structural consolidation into personal ascendancy. His fall had shown that ultimate authority still resided with the emperor, if he acted decisively. Across centuries, Roman rulers oscillated between concentration and diffusion of power, between reliance on elite guards and fear of their influence. The empire's longevity lay in its capacity to adapt institutions without abandoning the core principle that armed force underpins sovereignty. When Constantine dismantled the Castra Praetoria, he erased a physical symbol. He did not erase the lesson. Long after the Praetorian camp was torn down, the logic that had sustained it remained embedded in imperial rule. Rome had learned that proximity to armed power could elevate a servant into a sovereign threat. It had also learned that no emperor could rule without it. To understand what truly happened after Sejanus' savage fall, one must look beyond the spectacle of his execution and into the administrative reflexes that followed. His destruction was not merely punitive, it was corrective. Tiberius did not dismantle the system Sejanus had used. He reasserted control over it. That decision shaped the next 3 centuries. In the immediate years after AD 31, the Senate functioned under heightened scrutiny. Treason prosecutions intensified before gradually stabilizing. The emperor's distrust, once focused on a single prefect, widened into structural suspicion. The political class internalized caution as habit. Speech narrowed. Public alignment shifted swiftly with imperial signals. This psychological compression did not fade quickly. It became part of governing culture. The Roman imperial system had always balanced appearances. Augustus had framed his authority within republican forms. Magistracies continued. The Senate deliberated. Elections were held. Yet after Sejanus, the gap between form and force grew clearer. Everyone in Rome understood that real power lay where military loyalty converged with imperial command. The Castra Praetoria stood as physical evidence of that convergence. Soldiers within its walls were not frontier legionaries hardened by distant campaigns. They were elite troops stationed beside the political heart of the empire. Their daily visibility altered the city's atmosphere. Senators entering the Curia knew that armed cohorts stood nearby. The guard did not need to act constantly, its presence was sufficient. This proximity fostered a new kind of political calculation. Advancement depended less on rhetorical brilliance or aristocratic lineage and more on alignment with imperial favor. The equestrian order gained expanded administrative importance. Sejanus himself had emerged from it, demonstrating that birth into the senatorial aristocracy was no longer the sole path to influence. After his fall, emperors continued to elevate equestrians into key bureaucratic roles, though carefully fragmenting their authority. The prefecture of the guard survived Sejanus but was treated with caution. No later prefect was allowed to accumulate comparable dominance without scrutiny. Authority was distributed among multiple officials. Information channels were diversified. Emperors became more attentive to intelligence gathering within their own courts. In military terms, the consolidation of the guard created a template for rapid coercive response. Urban unrest could be contained swiftly. Conspiracies could be intercepted. This efficiency had undeniable advantages. Rome, unlike many ancient capitals, rarely descended into uncontrolled mob rule during the early empire. Order was maintained not only through law but through concentrated force. Yet the same concentration magnified the stakes of betrayal. If the guard turned against an emperor, the consequences were immediate. Later assassinations, from Gaius to Commodus, demonstrated this risk. Sejanus' example lingered as a warning to both prefects and princes. Ambition and distrust could coexist within the same walls. Beyond Rome, provincial elites observed these developments carefully. Loyalty to the emperor required distance from factional intrigue in the capital. Governors commanded legions far from the Praetorian camp, creating a parallel axis of military legitimacy. When civil wars erupted, as in AD 69 or 193, it was often these provincial forces that ultimately decided the outcome. The empire's survival depended on the fact that military power was not entirely monopolized in Rome. This duality, centralized guard and dispersed legions, produced a dynamic tension. Emperors had to maintain confidence in both spheres. Excessive favoritism toward the guard risked alienating frontier armies. Neglecting the guard risked immediate instability in the capital. Strategic governance became an exercise in calibrated distribution of honor, pay, and command. The legal system reflected similar balancing. The law of maestas, which had expanded under Tiberius and been weaponized during Sejanus' ascendancy, never fully receded. It remained available as a tool against perceived threats. Yet emperors learned to deploy it selectively. Overuse eroded elite cooperation. Underuse risked emboldening rivals. The line between security and paranoia required constant adjustment. The long-term transformation of imperial ideology also bears Sejanus' imprint. The emperor increasingly appeared as the singular axis of stability, surrounded by potentially dangerous subordinates. Trust became a scarce commodity. Loyalty was rewarded but never assumed. The court environment, especially in later centuries, grew ritualized and hierarchical, reinforcing distance between ruler and officials. Even architectural changes reflected this evolution. Later imperial palaces were designed with layered access, guarded corridors and controlled entry points. Physical space mirrored political caution. The open visibility of early Principate governance gave way to more fortified settings, particularly in the Eastern Empire. Sejanus himself vanished from official memory, condemned and erased. Yet historians such as Tacitus preserved his narrative as a moral and political lesson. Writing under later emperors, Tacitus portrayed Sejanus as the embodiment of corrupt ambition, a warning against allowing equestrian officials to eclipse senatorial authority. His account, shaped by senatorial perspective, may exaggerate certain elements. Still, the broader pattern he describes aligns with structural evidence. A prefect whose consolidation of military force enabled unprecedented influence. Modern analysis tempers ancient hostility but does not dismiss the transformation. Sejanus did not attempt an open coup in the manner of later usurpers. His strategy was incremental: acquire access, remove rivals, seek dynastic connection. His fall was engineered by imperial counterstrategy rather than battlefield defeat. That distinction matters. It illustrates the sophistication of Roman political maneuvering in the early empire. Ultimately, what happened after his fall was not restoration but adaptation. Rome did not dismantle the mechanisms he exploited. It refined them. The empire emerged more centralized, more cautious, and more overtly dependent on military alignment than before. Sejanus died in disgrace. The structures he sharpened outlived him by centuries. If Sejanus had succeeded, Rome might have faced a sudden civil war. Because he failed, Rome evolved more quietly. His execution did not break the imperial system, it hardened it. The deeper consequence of his fall was psychological rather than architectural. Institutions can be rebuilt, camps dismantled, offices renamed. Suspicion, once normalized at the center of power, endures far longer. After AD 31, no emperor could entirely trust the man who commanded his personal guard. And no prefect could forget how quickly imperial favor could invert into annihilation. Tiberius' calculated strike against Sejanus demonstrated something profound about the Roman imperial structure. It allowed for correction without collapse. There was no open battle in the streets, no competing standards raised above rival legions within the capital. The removal occurred through decree, arrest, and execution within a single day. This capacity for internal excision, swift, legalistic, and terminal, became a defining feature of imperial resilience. Yet resilience carried cost. The Senate's rapid reversal exposed the fragility of aristocratic autonomy. Public loyalty became performative. Statues erected one month could be destroyed the next. Honorific inscriptions no longer signified enduring prestige. They reflected temporary alignment with power. This awareness reshaped elite ambition. Survival required vigilance rather than confidence. The administrative class also absorbed the lesson. Equestrian officials continued to fill vital posts across the empire: finance, provincial governance, military logistics, but their advancement operated within clearer constraints. Authority was segmented deliberately. Where Sejanus had combined proximity, military command, and political networking, later emperors separated these vectors. Power was distributed across overlapping offices to reduce the likelihood of concentrated dominance. Military adaptation followed similar logic. Even before the formal disbandment of the Praetorian Guard centuries later, emperors experimented with balancing forces. New elite units were created alongside the guard. Command structures shifted. Prefects were appointed in pairs at times, diluting singular authority. None of these measures eliminated risk entirely, but they signaled institutional memory at work. The broader empire, stretching from Britain to Syria, continued to operate through a lattice of legions and governors. External campaigns did not pause because of Sejanus' fall. The Rhine frontier required vigilance. The Danube remained volatile. In the east, Rome confronted Parthian and later Sasanian power. The machinery of war and diplomacy proceeded with relative continuity, suggesting that the imperial center, though tense, retained functional coherence. What changed was the interpretation of proximity. Physical closeness to the emperor became both opportunity and danger. Courtiers, military officers, and advisors operated within a sphere where favor could elevate them rapidly but also expose them fatally. The court evolved into a space of layered security, controlled audiences, and guarded communication. The emperor's accessibility diminished over time, reinforcing both mystique and distance. This gradual transformation influenced imperial culture beyond the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Under later rulers, ceremonial protocol expanded. Audiences were staged with increasing formality.
The emperor's image shifted from first citizen among senators to remote autocrat. While this evolution had multiple causes, territorial scale, military pressure, cultural change, the memory of internal betrayal contributed to the tightening of access. In legal terms, the concept of treason matured into a versatile instrument. It could protect the state from genuine conspiracy, but it also functioned as a deterrent. The precedent of Sejanus illustrated that even the highest-ranking official could be destroyed under its authority. Law and force intertwined seamlessly. Strategically, Rome learned to operate under perpetual contingency. Succession planning became a central concern. Adoption of heirs, designation of Caesars, and elevation of co-emperors reflected attempts to preempt the vacuum that ambitious figures might exploit. These mechanisms were not always successful, yet they reveal an empire aware of its internal fault lines. The geopolitical environment amplified these concerns. As Rome expanded, communication delays between frontiers and the capital created informational asymmetry. A governor commanding legions on the Rhine could be proclaimed emperor before Rome fully understood the situation. The existence of a centralized guard did not prevent such declarations. It complicated the response. The emperor needed sufficient force near the capital to maintain order, yet also strong provincial armies to defend borders. Balancing these demands became a permanent strategic challenge. Sejanus' life illustrates the tension between delegated authority and sovereign control. Tiberius required a capable administrator in Rome during his absence. Sejanus fulfilled that role efficiently. The problem arose when administrative efficiency fused with personal ambition. The empire had granted him tools, command of the guard, influence over treason trials, proximity to the imperial household. He used them logically within the system's allowances until imperial suspicion intervened. After his death, emperors grew more conscious of the line between empowerment and exposure. Delegation continued, but with layered oversight. Intelligence networks expanded. Informal reporting channels complemented formal hierarchies. The state became both more bureaucratic and more watchful. Over time, these adaptations contributed to the durability of the Roman Empire. It endured crises that might have shattered less flexible systems. Civil wars occurred, but institutions absorbed shock and recalibrated. Even the eventual fall of the Western Empire did not erase Roman governance. It persisted in the East. Sejanus is often remembered as a cautionary tale of ambition. More accurately, he was a catalyst revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in concentrated military proximity to political authority. His fall exposed the fault line. The centuries that followed represent Rome's ongoing effort to manage it. The savage spectacle of his execution was immediate. The structural consequences were generational. By the time the Roman Empire entered late antiquity, the name Sejanus had faded from public consciousness. But the architecture of caution he helped shape remained embedded in imperial behavior. Empires do not remember through monuments alone. They remember through reflex. The reflex that followed AD 31 was simple. Never allow a single subordinate to command both armed proximity and unchecked access to the sovereign. That principle echoed through centuries of imperial design. It influenced how emperors appointed generals, how they structured courts, how they distributed honors, and how they guarded their own physical presence. In the Eastern Roman Empire, where imperial continuity outlasted the fall of the West, palace politics developed elaborate layers of security and ceremony. Elite units, such as the excubitors and later the Varangian Guard, protected the emperor, yet their commanders rarely accumulated autonomous political machinery comparable to Sejanus. Authority was deliberately fragmented. Eunuchs, generals, civil administrators, and patriarchs all held influence, but their power intersected rather than merged. This segmentation did not eliminate coups. Byzantine history is marked by palace revolutions and military rebellions. Yet even in those upheavals, the pattern reflects institutional memory. No single military prefect dominated for decades while quietly dismantling rival heirs from within the ruling house. When powerful generals rose, they did so openly, proclaimed by armies, not as shadow administrators operating behind imperial correspondence. In the West, after AD 476, successor kingdoms adopted fragments of Roman administration. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, each retained aspects of Roman bureaucracy and military organization. The idea that centralized armed forces must be balanced against aristocratic elites persisted in altered forms. Medieval courts would confront similar dilemmas: how to empower commanders without creating rivals. Sejanus' career also shaped historical narrative itself. Tacitus' account, written decades later, framed him as the archetype of the corrupt minister whose ambition corrodes the state. This literary construction influenced subsequent Roman political thought. The danger of the overmighty subject became a recurring theme in imperial and later monarchical ideology. Even when details of Sejanus' life were debated, the symbolic lesson endured. Psychologically, his story revealed the volatility of favor. Roman political culture, already competitive, grew more attuned to abrupt reversals. Courtiers learned to moderate public enthusiasm for rising figures. Excessive association with a powerful minister could become fatal overnight. Moderation, ambiguity, and cautious praise became survival strategies within elite circles. The imperial office itself evolved under this pressure. Emperors adopted increasingly elevated titles and ceremonial distance, reinforcing the asymmetry between ruler and subordinate. The more absolute the emperor appeared, the less plausible it seemed that a prefect or advisor could stand beside him as near equal. This ideological shift reduced the space in which another Sejanus might plausibly attempt dynastic integration. Yet structural risk never vanished. The tension between military strength and civil governance is inherent in any empire dependent on force. Roman rulers continually navigated this boundary. When balance failed, civil war followed. When balance held, stability endured. The broader geopolitical impact of these internal adjustments was subtle but significant. By refining mechanisms of succession and control, the empire preserved coherence across vast territories. Administrative continuity allowed tax systems to function, roads to be maintained, and armies to be supplied. Even during crises, the imperial framework rarely dissolved entirely. Instead, it reconfigured. Consider the contrast between Sejanus' fall and later imperial overthrows. His execution was confined to the capital, managed through senatorial decree under imperial directive. Later civil wars, by contrast, involve entire regions mobilizing behind rival claimants. The difference illustrates how early imperial structures contained instability within institutional channels. Over time, as militarization intensified, those channels widened into open conflict. The seeds of that expansion lie partly in the consolidation of force within political space. Sejanus did not intend to reshape centuries. His objectives were immediate: influence, security, perhaps dynastic elevation. But by demonstrating both the potential and the peril of concentrated military authority adjacent to the throne, he forced Rome to confront its own design. His destruction reaffirmed the supremacy of the emperor. His career exposed the fragility of delegated power. From that paradox emerged a more guarded imperial order. When historians examine Rome's endurance, they often emphasize legions, engineering, law, and cultural integration. These elements were essential. Yet the subtler dimension, how Rome managed internal ambition without constant systemic collapse, is equally critical. The fall of Sejanus stands as one of the earliest major tests of that capacity. Rome passed the test, but it emerged changed. In the end, Sejanus did not die on a battlefield. He died in a city he believed he controlled. That is what makes his fall enduring. His body was dragged down the Gemonian stairs, exposed to the fury of a population that had praised him weeks earlier. The Senate that had voted him honors voted his destruction. The guard he had commanded obeyed another master. In a single day, the illusion of permanence dissolved. Yet the true aftermath was not measured in hours. It unfolded across centuries. Sejanus revealed a structural truth about the Roman Empire. Power near the emperor was more dangerous than power far from him. Provincial generals could rebel, but they did so openly, banners raised. A prefect within the capital could alter succession quietly, through access, through accusation, through control of the guard. His ambition operated within the bloodstream of the state. Tiberius' response demonstrated equal clarity. He did not confront Sejanus with open force. He replaced him carefully, secured the guard's loyalty, and acted through institutional channels. The correction was internal, surgical, decisive. Rome learned that the emperor's ultimate weapon was not merely the sword but timing. After AD 31, emperors ruled with sharper awareness. They elevated capable administrators, but limited their convergence of influence. They rewarded loyalty, yet guarded against intimacy. The Praetorian Guard remained centralized for centuries, but its commanders rarely enjoyed the same unchecked ascent. When later prefects gained prominence, emperors remembered how quickly prominence could metastasize. The Senate, too, adapted. It survived not by resisting imperial supremacy, but by aligning with it swiftly. The spectacle of Sejanus' condemnation reinforced that survival required flexibility. The body that once claimed to govern the Republic became expert in reading imperial intention. Its authority persisted symbolically, its independence narrowed. In military terms, the concentration of armed force in Rome accelerated the politicization of the army. Future emperors could not ignore the expectations of elite troops stationed at the heart of power. Donatives, ceremonial oaths, and personal appearances became instruments of stability. The empire's fiscal and administrative systems adjusted accordingly, intertwining military loyalty with economic reward. As centuries passed, reforms attempted to diffuse risk. Authority was divided among co-emperors. Capitals multiplied, guards were restructured and eventually dissolved. Yet none of these changes erased the fundamental lesson. Sovereignty rests on controlled force, and controlled force must itself be controlled. When Constantine dismantled the Praetorian camp, he removed a physical embodiment of Sejanus' world. But he did not dismantle the imperial reliance on elite protectors. He redistributed it. Later emperors in Constantinople would navigate palace intrigues guarded by new units, mindful that proximity to armed loyalty remained both shield and threat. Even the fall of the Western Empire reflects this tension. Powerful generals overshadowed weak emperors, repeating a dynamic first dramatized under Tiberius. The names changed: Stilicho, Ricimer, Odoacer, but the structural vulnerability endured. Concentrated military authority near the throne could either sustain it or supplant it. Sejanus' ambition failed because he misjudged the emperor's resolve. He believed access equaled security. He believed consolidation equaled permanence. He underestimated the capacity of the imperial system to excise him once suspicion crystallized. Rome did not mourn him. It absorbed him. His career became a silent template, an example studied, feared, and avoided. The empire refined surveillance, segmented authority, and ritualized distance between ruler and subordinate. Autocracy grew more formal, less improvisational. Trust became rarer, hierarchy more pronounced. The savage fall of Sejanus was not the beginning of Roman autocracy, nor was it the end of political intrigue. It was a moment of exposure. It revealed how fragile the balance between delegation and dominance truly was. It showed that even in a system designed to avoid monarchy's excesses, power could concentrate rapidly in the hands of one ambitious official. And it proved that the emperor, if decisive, could still reclaim it. In the centuries that followed, Rome would fracture, reform, divide, and endure. Borders would shift. Faith would transform the empire's identity. Capitals would rise and fall. But the central dilemma Sejanus embodied, the danger of armed proximity to political authority, remained woven into imperial consciousness. His statues were smashed. His name was condemned. His lessons survived. The empire that executed him became more cautious, more militarized, and more controlled. That is what happened after his fall. It did not end with his death. It reshaped the state that killed him.